Well, now,
Okay, I can see it winking at me.
yeah.
So there is copylefted free software, most GNU software, and others. There's also non-copylefted free software, such as X and BSD. They're both free software. It's a difference of strategy. Those people are saying that they're not going to say no to anybody. So they're not going to take away your freedom. However, they're not going to actively fight to stop somebody else from taking away your freedom. So they're not doing anything wrong, but they're not doing as much as they could to defend freedom. I would rather do the most possible to defend freedom. So the idea of copyleft is it sets up a system whereby we can defend each other's freedom so that it makes the community as a whole stronger. It's a disagreement over strategy. I wouldn't say that those people are in X and BSD that they are doing something wrong, but I would say that they are doing less than they could to defend freedom. In any case, the software they write is free software, and we can use it in free operating systems. So, now that I've explained all these philosophical issues and these different ways of doing free software, I should go back to explaining the history of things. I left off in 1985 when we formed the Free Software Foundation. The purpose of the foundation is to raise funds to pay people to work on promoting free software. Typically, we've paid them to write software and write manuals. And this is one way that we develop parts of GNU. But most of the work is actually done by volunteers. Now, there are some full-time volunteers. I'm a full-time volunteer for GNU because I'm not getting paid by the FSF. Now, why is that? Well, as the president of the FSF, it's my job to decide how to spend the money. And I have to spend it in the most effective way. Now, when we had enough money to pay one person, I realized that if we paid it to Stallman, it would be like throwing the money away, because we could get Stallman to work for nothing. So I decided we would not pay Stallman. So we don't pay Stallman a salary, and we also don't pay for his travel. And the reason for that is, well, I realized that if the FSF were paying me to travel around the world all the time, then that's a lot of fun in some ways. So it would be pretty much a mockery to say that the FSF wasn't paying me. So we have a rule: the FSF never pays for my travel, except maybe a taxi across town to an appointment, if that's necessary. So in those respects, I always have to get myself funded. And there are other full-time volunteers too. Mostly those people are being paid by somebody else. So there are people who work for the various free software companies like Cygnus, Cyclic, I think there's one here called Sendio. And others are working at universities and working on free software. So there are various ways. There are also people who have individual consulting businesses where they develop improvements to free software and contribute those to the community. They too are full-time volunteers, you might say. If they're working on GNU software, then they're full-time volunteers for GNU. But there are lots and lots of part-time volunteers who are doing work and not getting paid for it at all. A lot of programmers, it turns out, want to work on free software. Even people who have full-time jobs working on other software want to work on free software in their spare time. And there are various reasons for this. One reason why people work on free software is Well, you have to get a job done, so you write a program to do it, and then you might as well share it with people. Another reason is for pride or reputation. You know, if hundreds of thousands of people are using a program you wrote, they'll really admire you, assuming they like the program. But if they're using it by their own choice, they probably like it, or they wouldn't use it. So you can really feel good with so many people using your software. Another reason is political idealism. That's my reason that's why I wrote the various pieces of GNU that I wrote, because I wanted to change, to build this alternative community so we could escape from the proprietary software way of life. And another reason is to share with your friends. You know, once you start feeling that you're part of a community, it starts to feel very natural to contribute to that community sometimes. So you'll think, oh, well, I could write a free program to do this, and people will like it, and I'll be sharing with the other people who have shared with me. And another reason is that it's fun. For some people, and especially some very good programmers, writing software is tremendous fun. And even if they're working on software all day, at work maybe somebody's telling them what to do. Then they can go home and write something and decide for themselves exactly what to do and how to do it, which means that it can be a lot more fun. So there are many reasons why people write free software, and many reasons why some of them are volunteering for GNU. I hope that if you have used the GNU system or some GNU software, that you will contribute to our community too, by writing free software or writing free manuals. Those are things we need very much. We also need help in other ways. At the moment, we have a project to make a directory of free software, which is basically a database with an entry for every free software package that's worth using. Now, this is a big job. We've hired one person to do this, but that person is going to need help from a lot of volunteers. And this is something which you can help with even if you're not a programmer. So if you're interested in helping with this, send mail, helping in any of these ways, send mail to gnu@gnu.org. So during the 1980s, we were developing replacements for one piece after another of Unix. Of course, we didn't develop them in any particular order. You know, whenever it seemed like good to replace a certain piece, we worked on that piece, or when somebody was inspired to do it. Because after all, we had to have them all, so it didn't matter which one we did first and which one we did last. The important thing was to do one after another, after another, after another, after another. In some cases, other people developed packages that did a part of the job. They had their own reasons. They weren't doing this to produce a free operating system, but it didn't matter what their reasons were after all. If some other person or project released a free program that did a job in the system, we could use it. The project being so large that many people said it was impossible, we had to be looking for shortcuts. So anytime there was a suitable package available, I would decide, okay, let's use that. And that's why we didn't try to develop a Windows system for GNU. Now, Unix in 1984 didn't have a Windows system, but I had done work on Windows systems already on other computers, and I decided that we should offer people a Windows system. But fortunately, X became available, and although it wasn't done by people, it wasn't done for our sort of reasons, it was available as free software. It was fit for the purpose. So I decided we would use X, and we wouldn't develop our own Windows system. Good, that's one big job we saved. but there was still a lot of work to be done. And so we were replacing, there were many pieces of the system that we had to replace, that we didn't get from anybody else. And so as we replaced them one after another, eventually it was useful to make a list of what was still missing. So I sat down with a Unix wizard and we made a list, and that became the GNU task list. Of course, I added to it a bunch of other things that I thought would be nice to have in the system, which Unix didn't have. Nowadays, all those jobs of replacing pieces of Unix are done. But there are lots of things still in the task list if you're looking for something that might be useful to do. Then, by 1991, the job was almost finished. There was only one essential component that we didn't have, and that was the kernel. And we were working on a kernel. But we chose a design that I thought would help us get it done faster, but actually it had the opposite effect. I chose to use an existing microkernel called Mach as the basis, the lowest layer, and on top of that write user programs that would implement the features of the Unix kernel. I should say, I chose to do this, but I wasn't the one working on it myself. It was staff of the Free Software Foundation that were working on it. But in any case, it turned out that debugging these multi-threaded asynchronous programs sending messages to each other was very difficult. And the Bootstrap environment was bad too, and there were lots of problems. So it took many years to get the kernel to work at all. But fortunately, people didn't have to wait for that, because in 1991, Linus Torvalds wrote a free kernel. Well, he wrote a kernel using the tried and true monolithic design, and then he decided to release it as free software. And this meant that a kernel was available. Now, we didn't know about this at first because he didn't contact us. And he called this kernel Linux. So we didn't know about it, but he did announce it to other groups of people. And they, of course, were interested in seeing if they could make a complete system. So they looked around to see what else was available to put into that system. And lo and behold, everything they needed was already there. What good fortune, they thought. So they then proceeded to put Linux, the kernel, into the kernel-shaped gap in the GNU system. But they didn't realize that that's what they were doing. They thought they were taking all these different pieces of the system and putting them together around Linux. They didn't realize, you see, that it was the GNU system that they were getting. So they called the result a Linux system. And so, ironically, the GNU system's goal was achieved, and yet at the same time, a disaster happened. The availability of Linux was a tremendous step forward because it made possible a complete free system, which was our goal. So our goal had been reached. It was at that point possible to get a modern computer and put on a free operating system and use the computer without letting anyone put chains on you. So the goal of the GNU project was achieved. But at the same time, the fact that they called this system Linux when really it was basically the GNU system was devastating for the GNU project, because that is when the users began to lose sight of the connection between us and our work. Until that time, we had software and we had our philosophy. And the software called people's attention to the philosophy, and the philosophy encouraged people to contribute to the software. So the two were promoting each other. When people started calling the GNU system Linux, that broke this link. So the philosophy still encouraged people to develop free software, but when people were using the free software, they didn't think, I'm using GNU. They thought, I'm using Linux. Essentially, they focused all their attention on the kernel and lost sight of the whole part we had done. So at this point, the system began encouraging a different philosophy, which is the philosophy of Linus Torvalds, who is basically an apolitical engineer. He likes to work on what's cool. He enjoys having free software, but he doesn't think it's a moral issue. He doesn't encourage people to stand up and fight for their freedom. And while it's true that that encourages some people to work on free software in some ways, it doesn't spread determination to preserve your freedom. Linus even writes some non-free software and says so in public. So his philosophy is that that's okay. Now, sometimes people give me the advice. They say, why worry about who gets the credit, whether it's Linus or the GNU project? After all, the important thing is that the job gets done. So since the system, isn't the important thing that the system exists? Well, that advice it's basically a wise principle, but it's based on one mistaken assumption. The important thing is not that the system exists today. It's what's going to happen 5 or 10 years from now. Whether we will continue to have a free operating system we can use on modern computers, that is not assured. It depends on our doing hard work. There are many challenges in our future. We can't relax and say, the job has been done, we can't lose any more, we don't have to worry, let's just relax and let things take their course. In fact, freedom is never guaranteed, it always faces threats. And people can never hold on to their freedom unless they're thinking about it. So what are some of these challenges that we face? One of them is how to drink tea. Well, but anyway, I've been carrying a backpack too much in the past few days, all knotted up. Hardware doesn't stand still. New hardware products are developed and old ones are discontinued. And sometimes the new products don't come with specifications. They'll sell you the hardware and they won't tell you how to use it. Now to me that seems like a shocking, outrageous idea, but it's not unusual. And most people seem to be willing to accept it. Unfortunately, if the specs are not available, it's hard to write free software to use that hardware. So the question is, how are we going to ever get free software to support the new hardware devices? Well, there are two ways we can try to bring this about. One of them is through reverse engineering. A couple of a few programmers can do a lot of work to figure out how some non-free program is running that hardware. And then, having figured it out, they can write a free program to do the job. But this is so much work that we can't count on people to do it unless they value the freedom that they will get. You see, these hardware devices with secret specifications often, although there's no free software to run them, often there is a proprietary driver to run them. And if people think that a proprietary program is good enough, why would they go to the trouble of making a free program? You see, our future ability to support these pieces of hardware depends on what we value. Well, it only takes a few people to do the work of reverse engineering. But the rest of us can do something else that is a lot easier. Namely, we can refuse to buy that hardware until it's supported by free software. We can apply market pressure. If there are 20 million of us, we should have a lot of market pressure to apply if we were organized to use it and aware of the need to use it. But most of us are not. Most of these users have not been exposed to the idea that we should insist on having a 100% free system. Most of them are perfectly happy. They get the non-free driver and they say it works, it's okay. So we fail to use the power that we have. So once again, the future of our community depends on what we value. This is not the only place where we face problems. Nowadays, a lot of people are adding non-free software to the system. In fact, nowadays you can find the combined GNU/Linux system, the GNU system with Linux as the kernel, that is. You can find CD-ROMs in software stores which have this system. But those CD-ROMs almost always have some non-free software also. The companies that package them have added this non-free software to make it better, they say. And when they say that, they're telling you that non-free software is okay. There are lots of magazines about the GNU/Linux operating system. Of course, most of them call it Linux. And most of them are full of advertisements for non-free software. Now, those advertisements are for many different products. But there's one message that they all have, and that is, non-free software is good for you. It's so good for you, you might even pay to get a copy. And they call these things value-added packages, which makes a statement about values. It says, practical convenience is more important than your freedom. I have different values, so I call them freedom-subtracted packages. Because once you've installed a free operating system and you're enjoying the freedom that we have worked for many years to give you, you now have the opportunity to buckle on some chains by installing these freedom-subtracted packages. And all of these companies and magazines, they all support the open source movement, which doesn't talk about these issues. Doesn't say non-free software is bad because it's putting chains on you. It just talks about whether it's convenient or not. And they do, in fact, convince a lot of people to switch to using some free software because it's practical and convenient. But when people have chosen free software for those purely practical reasons, they can easily switch back to non-free software anytime that is more convenient. And you know, the people who work on non-free software, they're not all stupid. They're not all incompetent. Sometimes they can do a good job if you judge in a limited, purely technical sense. They can offer you programs that are practical and convenient and subjugate you. But if you don't care about the last part, you might use them. You might even think it's good. So the support we have gained, we can lose it just as fast anytime the non-free software developers get ahead of us. And there's a specific reason that might help them get ahead of us. And that has to do with software patents. Now, software patents are especially a problem in the US, but the problem is beginning to some extent in Europe as well. The danger is that techniques of programming, algorithms, features, techniques of communicating over the network, all these things can be patented. And when they're patented, it means that some person or company has a monopoly on using them. and we are not allowed to implement them. Now, the US Patent Office is totally incompetent, and they issue patents on trivial ideas every day. But even if you imagine a patent office that was smarter and where they did a good job, so to speak, suppose they only patented techniques that really are new. Imagine if free software was not allowed to use any technique or feature that was actually new within the past 20 years. So we were limited to writing the kinds of software that were in use 20 years ago. How much could we satisfy the user's needs that way? 20 years is a long time in software. The only way free software has a chance is if we block software patents. Now, there is an effort to block software patents in Europe. You should read about you should read the site www.freepatents.org and get involved, form an organization, organize small companies in Europe, and not just free software companies, because a lot of small software companies see that software patents are dangerous for them. Because when you're writing a program that's 100,000 lines, that means a lot of different things that somebody else might have patented already. A lot of different points where you are vulnerable to being attacked. It's also to compare it with trying to cross a minefield, because at each step, chances are you will not step on a mine. But your chances of getting across the whole minefield without once stepping on a mine get to be smaller and smaller the bigger the thing is. So this is very important. Please follow up on it. So what happens then if there's certain nice features that free software can't have, but the non-free software can? Well, what does the free software movement say about this? We say the software patents are an outrage because they're interfering with our freedom. What does the open source movement say? They say, well, we told you that open source software was going to be more powerful and convenient. I guess we were wrong. See, when people start doing these things purely for the practical reasons offered by the open source movement, they interpret the consequences of patents as saying, well, they should go back to the non-free software. When people support the free software movement, that is, when people want freedom because they value freedom independently of practical convenience, then the people will fight to put an end to the software patents. They won't take the patents as a reason why the whole idea of free software was a mistake. So it's a real problem that right now most of the companies and magazines are supporting the open source movement. It's going to be up to us individuals to spread the word about the free software movement if we want to teach the people who are using the system to value the freedom, which was the reason why the system exists. Now, a further kind of problem happens when people accept a non-free program as if it were an essential part of the system. And this problem shows its worst form when the non-free program is used as the basis for developing other software. For example, if it's a library or if it implements a new programming language. In fact, it's happened several times that some non-free program was conveniently available, and many people started using it as the basis to develop free software. And in effect, they were falling into a trap, because although their own software was free, it was impossible to use that software without the non-free program it was based on. And that meant that this program, while free, was useless for any free operating system. We couldn't use it because we couldn't use the non-free library underneath it. This first happened with Motif back at around 1989 or so. Motif was a GUI toolkit, and it wasn't and still isn't free software, but it was conveniently available to a lot of people. And so they started basing their free software on it. And I tried asking them, no, please don't use Motif. And occasionally I succeeded, but more often I failed. So people started working on a free replacement for Motif, which is called Lestif. And it was about a couple of years ago that Lestif got to the point where it actually made most Motif applications run. So that problem is solved after 8 or 9 years. And then a few years later, another such problem developed, which is the Qt library, which was not free software, but it was available gratis for certain purposes. And people started using it as the basis for a large free software project called KDE. So, in effect, KDE was doing something very important, developing a desktop. And having made the decision to use Qt, they didn't want to decide that that was a mistake, so they had to convince themselves it was okay. And so they started telling everybody else it was okay and inviting more people to join them and make more software based on Qt, all of which could not be included in a completely free system. But the danger was that that software would become a good desktop and everybody would treat it as an absolute essential for the system, which would mean pressure for everybody to use the non-free program Qt. So this was a very big problem and getting worse every week. To address the problem, the GNU project started 2 activities, 2 forms of counterattack. One is we started developing a free replacement for Qt called Harmony. And the other is we started developing an alternative desktop. And the reason we started using both approaches at once is that this problem was so dangerous that we had to maximize the chance that we would solve it. Every free software project is uncertain. You know, it may succeed, it may not. It may just get only half done and never be finished. By having 2 parallel projects, we increased the chance that one or the other would succeed in solving the problem. As it happened, the desktop GNOME has become a success. Harmony has not become a success yet. People are still working on it. About half a year ago, Qt was re-released under a new license that makes it free software. I am convinced, although they don't say so, that this was in response to the success of our defensive actions. Because Qt is available as free software, KDE now can be used in a free system. So we managed to get them out of the trap that they were in, even though they weren't trying to get out of the trap. But, you know, it's much easier to recognize these traps and stay out of them than to get out of them once you're in them. And so it's really important to spread the word that this is an issue so that people will have their eyes open and not walk into these traps. The most recent trap of this kind was Java. When Java became available, it was so sexy that a lot of programmers started working on Java and writing their free software in Java, ignoring the fact that this meant that their software couldn't run on a free operating system because Sun's implementation of Java was not free. You know, it was available. You could run Sun's Java implementation on GNU/Linux, but that means you no longer have a free operating system because Sun's Java is not free. And likewise, Blackdown, which is currently the popular port of Sun's Java software to GNU/Linux, that is not free software. You shouldn't be using it. Now, of course, the only thing we could do was try to dig a ramp to get people out of this trap. And so we're developing free software to support Java. This includes the virtual machine Caffe, the compiler Copy, and GNU ClassPath providing libraries. But we still don't have all of the library facilities that Sun provides. So if you want to develop a Java program and you want to make it useful for the free world, you should use free software as the platform to develop it. That way, you will make sure you use only the facilities available in free software. Otherwise, you're liable to accidentally, without even thinking about it, use some library we don't have. And then your program won't run on a free system. And your program will serve as pressure for users to install the non-free Java implementation. So think about that. Every Java program that uses the non-free facilities is a pressure on users to install the non-free software to support Java. So what you do has effects on other people. And once again, the future of our community depends on our values. Finally, we're going to have to work politically to convince governments not to pass laws prohibiting free software. We've shown what people did not believe. We're capable of developing free software for a wide spectrum of uses. But we can't do it if governments prohibit it. So if governments adopt software patents and various different features become off limits to us, we can't do them. Or there are other threats, there are other reasons why governments are proposing to prohibit us from doing certain jobs. For example, playing DVDs. DVDs come with data encoded in a secret format. The reason it was kept a secret was so that everyone who wanted to make a DVD player could be forced to promise to build certain restrictions into those DVDs to restrict the users. And in particular, one thing that they're not allowed to do is release the source code for the player. So the result is that there was no way to play a DVD with free software. Then a few people in Europe got together and figured out the format and wrote a free program. One of them is Jon Johansen in Norway, a 16-year-old wizard who did a part of the job. So the free software was released, and immediately the movie companies started threatening everybody who published it and suing people who published it. And not only that, but they even managed to pressure the Norwegian government into threatening Jon Johansen with imprisonment. He's been accused of a crime of telling us how to play our DVDs. Now, this shows the kind of threat we face in the future, and we have to meet it very vigorously. Because of this, I have some handouts here about this problem, and I hope that Well, it's probably better if somebody takes these to the back so that when people leave, they can pick them up. Is that feasible?
Yeah.
What should we do?
We have a table outside.
You have a table. So these should be taken to the table, yeah, where they can be given out. Somebody do that? Yeah. Now, one of these describes the situation. One of them is a sample letter which has been written in Swedish. And it's best if you write your own letter in your own words, saying what you think about the issue. But if you don't do that, it's still good for something if you sign the letter we've written. So please do one or the other. It's a letter to the Prime Minister of Norway saying that the charges against Jon Johansen should be dropped and he should be given an award for public service. And if you have friends in Norway, ask them to write too. So, increasingly, we're going to have to fight in the traditional political arena to preserve our freedom. And it's going to be hard work. People who are only thinking about practical convenience are not going to bother. So, once again, our community's future depends on what we value. I hope that you will stand up for the free software movement and spread the word about freedom. And it will also help if you refer to the operating system we developed as GNU/Linux and correct other people if they call it just Linux. By calling attention to the GNU project, you will lead more people to see what we say about freedom. And in that way, you'll contribute to the activities of defending freedom. So at this point, I should introduce my alter ego. I'm Saint Ignatius of the Church of Emacs. I bless your computer, my child. I should explain that Emacs was initially a text editor which became a way of life and a religion. And so, as any religion should, it now has a schism, and it also has saints. No gods yet, fortunately. In the Church of Emacs, well, one advantage of the Church of Emacs, why you might consider joining, is that being a saint in the Church of Emacs does not require celibacy. So for some of you, that might make a difference. Some of us are involuntarily celibate. But it does require a moral commitment to live a life of purity. You have to make a commitment to exorcise the evil proprietary system from your computer, and then install a wholly free operating system, where holy could be spelled H-O-L-Y or W-H-O-L-E-L-Y, and then only install free software on top of that. If you make that commitment and live by it, then you too are a saint, and you may eventually have a halo. And And by the way, please don't ask me any questions about what kind of disk this came from or what data was on it, because I don't know. However, I can assure you that no non-free software is accessible on it. So at this point, it's hard work actually wearing the halo. At this point, I should ask for questions.
If you had a refrigerator or a car...
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. What did you say?
If you have a VCR or a car
or a what?
Having software in it, how can you make sure that it's not free?
Ah, okay. I had to think about where to draw the line between what counts as a computer and which things inside pieces of hardware I can ignore. And I came to the conclusion that if you can install software on it, if you can load software into it, or if you should be able to load software into it except that somebody else deliberately tried to stop you, then it counts as a real computer and I should insist on only using it with free software. But if it's a sort of one chip which contains a ROM, the kind of thing that might be inside a watch or a microwave oven, then I figured, for me, it's not acting like a computer, and so I don't have to consider it as one. So that's where I decided to draw the line. Now, one of the things about making moral judgments about the world is that you're constantly coming across gray areas. Gray areas are not something to be afraid of. They're normal. But you have to deal with them somehow. And this is how I've dealt with that particular gray area.
Have you had any problems with people or companies not upholding the copyleft?
Yes, we have. In fact, several times a year we find people disobeying the license. And so far, they have all come into compliance after either I had a discussion with them or we had our lawyers send them a couple of letters. So far it has never been necessary to sue them.
Beloved innocents, as the author of GCC, how do you view the future of C in view of more modern languages like C++ or Java?
Well, C++ is a lousy language. It's a lousy job of language design, a sloppy job of language design. Its grammar is ambiguous. And it has these just various different constructs that end up looking syntactically identical. So you just have to arbitrarily, heuristically say, we're going to interpret it this way instead of that way. And it has gratuitous, trivial incompatibilities with C. Now, if you're going to make an improved version with C, the most obvious thing is you should aim for upward compatibility unless there is some major reason why you can't do that. And yet in C++ you find these trivial changes that are of no great benefit. Maybe they were slightly better, but the point is compatibility is more important than that. And it has so many features, and it's focused primarily on making things convenient and optimizing the case where you know the type of error is going to work with various types to be defined by the user. Well, of course, C++ can do that, but it's mainly aimed at the other case, at the case where you do know all the types at compile time. So it was based on, I think, a mistaken emphasis. So because of this, I don't really recommend that people should use C++. Now, I would expect that Java is probably better. I've never learned it.
What language is Herd?
The Herd is written in C. If I want to write something and I think that Lisp is not suitable because it needs more speed, then I'm going to write in C. If I want a powerful language, well, all those others are not as powerful as Lisp. You start up Lisp and it starts doing a read eval print loop. Well, here we have three basic facilities, read, eval, and print. And those other languages don't have any of them. They don't have anything like them. They don't even have the concept. You know, in Java, is there read? Is there eval? Is there print? I don't think so. There's no representation for a Java program as data. It's just text. So there's no meaning for a read function. You know, and people have known these things since 1960. And yet people keep designing new languages which don't have them.
We have heard the story about how you came up with the GNU project, but is there a story behind the copyleft? Did you have any?
Well, the idea of copyleft I was thinking about for a couple of years before I started GNU. I was looking for some way that the community could defend itself against being abused and taken advantage of. A way that the community could avoid being a doormat. Because it's discouraging to feel that you're a doormat, and I felt that if we were doormats, if we had no way to defend ourselves, then it would feel too discouraging and we wouldn't get enough people to succeed. But the word copyleft I got from a letter that was sent to me, I think it was by Don Hopkins. He wrote a letter to me, and on the letter, on the envelope, he wrote all sorts of funny things. And one of them was, copyleft, all rights reversed. And I saw that word copyleft, and I thought, this is exactly the right name for what I've been thinking of. Except because, you know, I would rather have it copyleft, all wrongs reversed.
The different distributions for Linux has vital importance for the creation of reputation. And as you were speaking about,
As I know, there's only one distribution of Linux.
yes, but
It's released by, the one that Linus and Alan Cox release is the distribution of Linux, right? I'm sorry, you're talking about, oh, you're talking about the different versions of the GNU/Linux operating system. Please don't call that system Linux.
this is what I'm asking. Is there any thoughts of creating a distribution for the Free Software Foundation that has a name or
No.
significance?
And let me explain why. First of all, we don't want to develop another GNU/Linux distribution because it would be a substantial amount of work and it's not clear that there's any technical reason to do it. There's already a distribution which almost fits our ethical goals, and that is Debian. So, which by the way also recognizes that it's a distribution of GNU/Linux. So instead of making yet another one, I'd rather approach it by cooperating with the Debian developers and asking them to make small changes so that it becomes suitable for us to use. The other thing is, sometimes people ask me, why not make one distribution and call it GNU/Linux? Well, if I did that, then people would have the impression that all the others are not GNU/Linux. I want people to know that all of these distributions are versions of the combined GNU/Linux system. GNU/Linux means it's the combination of GNU and Linux. That's what the slash is for. If you could use a plus sign if you prefer. That would also be appropriate.
Have you dropped the development of the Unix GNU totally?
Of the Unix GNU? I don't understand.
The kernel that you were
No, people are still working on the GNU herd, but not tremendously actively. However, it does run more or less, and there are apparently an increasing number of people starting to play with it and building more packages to run on it. So at this point, you can get a fairly complete GNU/herd system. But the thing is, what you'll see is that it's basically the same as GNU/Linux, unless you want to actually play with the extra features of the kernel. Like, one of the advantages of the herd is that, in effect, you can write your own file systems, because each file system is just another separate user program that communicates with messages. The system comes with some of them, but you can write your own, and the system will happily use yours as well. So there are some interesting technical advances in the kernel. If you don't use them, it's basically the same as running GNU/Linux, as long as it doesn't crash.
Yeah, actually, I have two questions for you. The first one, when I started using GNU Emacs about 10 years ago, I was told it was for 8 megabyte constantly swapping. Is that correct?
Yeah, but computer memory is getting bigger and bigger and cheaper, so who cares? It also stands for Emacs makes all computing simple. And it stands for maybe 10 or 20 other things as well. And I think that Emacs comes with a list of some of them.
Well, I have another question, more deep question, I guess. You talked about your general public license, but you also have a lesser general public license. Could you explain the difference?
The lesser general public license gives permission to link the program with non-free software. The GNU General Public License does not give permission for that. Now, why do we sometimes use the lesser GPL? It's basically a strategic compromise. That is, in a few cases, it looks like we will have better overall success for the free software movement if we make a concession of a very localized nature, permitting linking a particular package into non-free software. So we do that by releasing that package under the lesser GPL.
What's your opinion about software that is closed source for a certain amount of time?
Well,
Released
I don't want to use the term closed source because, again,
non-GPL.
that basically gives your allegiance to the open source movement, and I don't want to wear their badge because these days the free software movement has to struggle to be heard at all. And so by using terms like, if you use terms like open source or closed source, you are essentially supporting the open source movement. If you use the terms free and non-free, you're supporting the free software movement. And you, of course, have the choice of which you want to do. But I have to make it clear which one I'm doing. So I'm going to support the free software movement. So I can't answer that question, but if we ask the question, what do I think of a program that's released as non-free temporarily and then gets made free? Well, first of all, the most important, assuming that the period of time is short enough, like not much more than a year, then I think that this does effectively and usefully contribute to the free software world, because we can afford to wait a year or so. Of course, those of us who only want to use free software, we will not use the newer version. We will wait, we will use the year-old free version. But a year is not that long a period of time, so the fact that we get these contributions delayed by a period of 1 year, it's still a useful contribution. So I encourage people, if people are unwilling to release the new versions as free software, I sometimes encourage them to use that delayed release approach because it's better for us than no contribution at all. On the other hand, if they were going to wait 3 years, that's such a long time, it basically destroys the whole point. So it has to be a short enough period of time that that the old version is reasonable to use.
Yeah, it feels like it's one of the ways to keep the software patents away, to keep your source for yourself for a certain amount of time.
Well, it doesn't, unfortunately. No, it doesn't help. Nothing is going to help against software patents, except to make sure they don't happen. The problem is that, yeah, you might put it off for a year that way, but they might be able to tell just from running your program that it infringes the patent. For a lot of patents, it's totally obvious. They're patents covering user-visible features. You don't need the source code to see that those patents are being infringed.
But instead of patenting the software, you delay the release of it.
There's no instead. It's a mistake to think that it's a choice of one or the other. No, this temporary delayed release is an alternative to keeping the software proprietary forever. And in that way, it serves a purpose. Sometimes I've convinced companies that were making their software proprietary to release it as free software after a delay, and that's a big step forward. However, it has nothing to do with the issue of software patents. Those are separate issues. This will not protect us from software patents. It will not help in any way with the problem of software patents.